Blankenship Publishing presents Nightlight, Book 2 of the Bloodbound series, by Amy Blankenship and R.K. Melton. Read for you by K.B. Stanford. Chapter 1. Quinn Wilder looked around Warren's office, not knowing if finding out who was behind the murders was a good thing or a bad thing. Most of the shouting match was over, or at least he hoped it was. He glanced at Kane now that the vampire had his back toward the room. Kane hadn't bothered to defend himself. Michael had done a good job of that for him. He should have been mad at the blonde vampire, and he should apologize in the same breath. But right now, all he felt for Kane was an odd fear and, as an animal of prey, he didn't like that feeling. Kane smirked as he stared out the window. He really needed to turn the volume down on hearing other people's thoughts. So, the Jaguars and the Cougars were together again. Big fucking deal. What did they want him to do, a happy dance? Well, tough, he wasn't in the mood. The soulless vampires outnumber us at least 10-1. If I remember correctly, Devon was always an aggressive fighter. Maybe we should call him and have him come back and help. Stephen offered his 2 cents. At the rate the vampire army is growing, it's quickly becoming a losing battle. If we don't rally an army of our own, then we might as well pack it up and get the hell out of Dodge. If the families hadn't been banned from each other for so long, you would have known Devon is busy chasing his reluctant mate halfway around the world right now, Kat answered Stephen, but she was glaring at Quinn when she said it. Sarcasm noted. Stephen grinned. His big brother had pissed Kat the hell off by kidnapping her. Glancing back at Quinn, he wondered why his brother hadn't said anything about Dean helping them with the vampires near the club. Having one of the fallen on their side was bragging rights, not something to keep a secret. He'd heard about the other fallen who had helped retrieve Devon's mate and her friend, but now that he'd left with Devon and the 2 girls, Dean was their only trump card. I second the motion of calling Devon back home in the hopes that the fallen... what was his name? Chris, Kat offered. If Chris comes back with Devon, then we'll have evened the odds, because we already have one of the fallen here who is willing to help us, Stephen finished. And just how do you suppose we get them back? Quinn asked, glancing toward Warren. You know how the males of our species react when we've found a mate. The only way Devon will come back is if his mate is with him. Here's a new idea for you. Tell him the truth, Kat growled and locked eyes with Quinn when he turned to look at her. She cocked an eyebrow at him, then smiled in satisfaction when he jerked his gaze away. Quinn inwardly winced at her barb, but said nothing in retaliation. Kane took a cigarette out of his case and lit it. I dare say the young lady among us does have a point. If you want the kittens to come back, you have to entice them. Sure, Michael said, trying to lighten the mood in the room. I'll just set a bowl of cream outside the back door and wait there with a butterfly net. Kane and Kat both grinned at the visual of Michael sitting in the dark with a butterfly net in his hands, waiting for some unsuspecting kitten to come and start lapping up a bowl of cream. Chris does need to come back, Kat finally conceded. I've seen him fight, and it's the equivalent of a serious F-bomb. But if I read him right, he won't come back without Tabby. How do you get a fallen to leave his charge and pick a side in a war? Stephen asked. You don't, Michael stated. The fallen are few and far between. The only 2 I've ever met are Dean and Chris, and you don't want to piss either one of them off. He glanced at Quinn. Is there any chance Dean would ask Chris to cut his vacation short? Several more questions were asked from the Jaguar side of the room, but Cain felt cold chills crawl across his skin as he blocked them out. He knew exactly who they were talking about. If Chris came back, then Tabitha would follow. Everyone but Michael twitched when Cain suddenly turned around and faced them. "The war's already started, so when you guys are finished kissing and making up, maybe you can join the hunt." He pushed the window open and jumped out, not caring that it was on the second floor. His long black duster flapped open behind him, looking very similar to dark wings before he dropped out of sight. As Cain disappeared, Michael rolled his eyes at his friend's dramatic exit and reached over to close the window. Everyone else thought Cain had landed on the ground, but he could sense him above them, on the roof. The meeting had actually gone better than Michael thought it would. Michael wondered if Cain even realized what he'd done when he'd shoved the bloodstone deep into Cain's flesh. When he bit his own wrist and bled into Cain's wound, it had been for two very good reasons. One was to help the stab wound heal faster, but the second reason had been purely selfish. With his blood now deep inside Cain's veins, he could track his friend's every movement. It still ticked him off that Cain had been within the city for quite a while and he'd not known it. He hadn't even been looking for him because he'd thought Cain was dead. If he'd found Cain a little sooner, maybe he could have stopped this mess before it had spiraled out of Cain's controlling hands. But now that he'd given blood to Cain, it would be better than a tracking device. If Cain decided to run, he wouldn't get far. "I don't see why Cain has such a bad attitude about this since he's the one who caused the vampire explosion to start out with," Nick said from where he was leaning against the door. He didn't mind Michael in the mix, but counting on Cain was a bad idea. The man didn't exactly seem stable. "You're just pissed because Cain decided not to be the enemy," Warren informed him, even though he wasn't too happy with Cain himself. But he wasn't going to bring up the fact that Cain had also set his sister up for Quinn to kidnap. Not until he had a better idea of just how sane the resurrected vampire really was. Michael started to take up for Cain, but there were too many toes to step on and enough guilt to go around. He knew Cain was still hiding something from him, and he was dying to find out what it was before it wound up eating his friend alive. He wished Cain would hurry up and realize that he wasn't alone anymore. On the other hand, Michael knew that Cain had gone through an experience he would never be able to completely understand the horror of. If faced with the same situation, Michael wasn't sure he could keep his sanity either. Cain was betrayed by one of his best friends and sentenced to an eternal exile with almost no hope of escape. His eyes narrowed toward the window, realizing that was one question he'd completely forgotten to ask. Just how had Cain been freed from the grave? Cain paced back and forth on the roof of Moondance, his hands fisted and uncurling at his sides. He could still see the look on Chris's face when he'd thrown him across the warehouse like trash. He couldn't fight the fallen. No one could stand up against the power one of them possessed. Even if they did call Chris in as reinforcement, and Tabitha came back with him, Cain knew Chris had no intentions of sharing her. It didn't happen very often, but Cain would bet the bloodstone buried in his body that the fallen was in love with Tabitha. If that was true, then Cain stood no chance of getting anywhere near his soulmate. He'd blown his chance, and it hurt like hell. Even if she didn't have a fallen angel sitting on her shoulder, Tabitha wouldn't have anything to do with him now. As for the others, he didn't care if the shifters liked him or not. This wasn't a popularity contest by any means. "Maybe it's best they don't like me," he whispered as he gazed out over the city. Cain nodded his head firmly and buried his hands in his pockets. He would stay long enough to help rid the city of the vampire riffraff he'd unintentionally created. But once that was done, he would go out on his own again. That way, when he decided to take off, there would be no one that cared enough to follow. The thought left him on edge. Trevor pulled up in Envy's driveway and shut off the car. He really wanted to talk to her and see how she was doing. Maybe she'd had time to think about what he'd told her. After all, it had been the truth. Glancing at the item in the passenger seat of his car, he smirked before grabbing it. He'd really done a number on the jeans he'd quote-unquote borrowed earlier in the week from Chad, and now he was going to return them. This was his good deed for the day. Hopefully, no one had ever been sent to hell for having a sense of humor. Unfolding the jeans, he took note of the dirt and black motor oil smeared all over them. Trevor had made a special exception and shifted back into his dog form to happily rip out the crotch. Hannah, Mrs. Tully's old cat who had decided to start living with him, had actually walked up and sniffed the jeans before turning around, lifting her tail in the air, and spraying them to get rid of the canine scent he'd left on them. Trevor didn't think he'd ever laughed so hard in his life. "Perfect," he whispered. Getting out of the car, he approached the front door and tossed the jeans over onto the bushes, almost laughing again when they slipped off the foliage and landed on a giant ant bed. This was too priceless. Ringing the doorbell, he shoved his hands in his pockets and waited for the door to open. When it finally did swing in, Trevor put on his best chastised expression. "Hey," he said quietly. Chad sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "Hey yourself, stranger." "Look, I know I messed up, and I wanted to talk to Envy. Or at least try, if you promise to keep the taser away from her," Trevor explained with a small smile. "I would, but Envy's not here," Chad answered as he pushed himself off the doorframe and stood to his full height. Jason had mentioned Trevor's name in the same sentence as the word stalker, and he hoped Jason was wrong. "She decided to take some time off and go hang out with Tabitha and Chris. I'm not sure when she'll be back." Trevor inhaled deeply and nodded when he noticed that Envy's scent wasn't fresh in the house. At least Chad wasn't lying about her not being home. "I need you to give her some information then." "Like what?" Chad asked, looking very serious. "She needs to stay away from Devin Santos. He's bad news and will end up hurting her." He hedged, hoping to drag Chad over to his side by playing on his protective brotherly instincts. Chad frowned at Trevor's warning and crossed his arms over his bare chest. "Kind of like you?" Trevor's complacent attitude took a nosedive. "Hey, what I did was part of my job. I didn't want to hurt Envy with my line of work. That's why I never told her what I do for a living." He looked away and shoved his hands deeper in his pockets, knowing Chad didn't have a clue. He hoped like hell Envy hadn't repeated exactly what he'd told her to Chad. Civilians didn't need to know about the things that go bump in the night, especially not a cop. "I told her the night you found me at the club that I was undercover, but I don't think she believes me," he added, watching Chad's reaction closely for any hint that he knew more than he needed to. Chad sighed. "Look, I know you liked my sister, but she's moved on. I think you should do the same thing. I'm not just telling you as a co-worker or even a friend. I'm telling you as someone that's been through it. Leave her alone and let her make her own decisions. Despite your best intentions, I think she's going out with Devin now." Trevor lifted his eyes to Chad's face. "What?" he asked dangerously. "She's dating Devin as far as I know," Chad repeated point blank. Trevor felt a chill race down his spine, turned around, and stalked away from the door without another word. Chad frowned when he noticed a cat through the front window of Trevor's car leaning up on the dashboard. The other man hurriedly got in his car, revved up the engine, and peeled out of the driveway. "Jason," Chad announced to the air, "you had best not be right about him being a stalker." Chad knew Envy had left town with Devon to join Chris and Tabitha for a short getaway. He wasn't about to tell Trevor that news, as Envy had sworn him to secrecy. It didn't matter anyway, because it wasn't any of Trevor's business what Envy did now. Chad shook his head and started to go back inside when he saw something blue out of the corner of his eye. His expression lit up when he saw his jeans laying on the ground and rushed over to pick them up, grimacing at the ants crawling all over them. His happiness faded when he saw all the rips and tears in them, and his eyes widened comically when he saw the crotch had been ripped out completely. Chad lowered the jeans and glared out at the street. "Dog, your ass is grass!"